The golden light of the throne is not a comfort. It is a weight that crushes the marrow in your bones until you can no longer remember the sensation of standing upright. I have served within the inner sanctum for 300 years, and in that time, the oxygen has tasted only of ozone and the copper tang of ancient, failing machinery. We do not speak of the silence that has begun to grow between the rhythmic thrumming of the life-sustaining systems, a silence that feels like a physical rot eating away at the edges of the throne world. The Astronomicon flickers now, not with the majesty of a star, but with the desperate, frantic pulse of a heart nearing total arrest. Every time the psychic tide recedes, I see the shadows on the walls of the palace stretch longer, darker, and more hungry than the day before. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The transition from the era of hope to this age of mechanical senility did not happen with a single catastrophic failure, but through the agonizingly slow accumulation of dust in the gears of the universe. I remember the exact moment the air filtration in the Sanctum Imperialis shifted its pitch, moving from a steady, reassuring thrum to a rhythmic, wet clicking that sounded like a dying man's breath. That sound has been the metronome of my life for 3 centuries, a constant reminder that the god, Emperor's physical shell, is not the only thing tethered to a failing apparatus. We move through the corridors of the palace like ghosts inhabiting a corpse, our boots clicking on cold adamantium floors that have not been polished since the last solar tithe was calculated correctly. The atmosphere here is thick with the scent of recycled sweat, stale incense, and the sharp, acidic tang of cooling fluid leaking from 1,000 different conduits. Everything is breaking, yet we are forbidden from truly fixing it. For to touch the machinery of the master of mankind is to risk a heresy that would see your soul unmade before your heart could beat its next panicked strike. I have watched the tech, priests of the Martian priesthood wander these halls with a frantic, desperate energy, their metallic limbs twitching in patterns of prayer that grow more erratic with every passing century. They do not understand the machines they tend anymore. They merely mimic the movements of their ancestors, hoping the spirits within the iron do not notice the ignorance of their caretakers. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from realizing the most powerful empire in human history is being held together by nothing more than habit and the lingering echoes of a genius long since departed. I see it in the eyes of the High Lords when they think no one is watching, a hollow, glass-like stare that reflects the flickering of the torchlight against the encroaching dark. They know the math does not add up, that the consumption of souls to fuel the Astronomicon is increasing even as the quality of the psychic harvest diminishes. We are feeding the fire with wet wood and expecting a roar, but all we receive is a choking smoke that blinds us to the horrors waiting in the void. My duties involve the transcription of the logistics reports from the outer sectors, and the numbers are a litany of slow motion collapse. Worlds are going dark not because of invasion, but because a single relay station failed, and no one possessed the specific ritual knowledge required to reboot its core. We are losing the galaxy one burnt out fuse at a time, and the weight of that realization is a physical pressure on my skull that never relents. I have seen the maps of the Imperium slowly bleeding grey as the light of the Emperor's beacon fails to reach the furthest fringes, leaving millions of souls to drift in a darkness that is no longer merely physical. In the sub-levels of the palace, where the machinery is oldest and the shadows are thickest, the sound of the clicking grows louder, a mechanical heartbeat that is out of sync with the universe. I sometimes find myself standing before the great cooling vents, watching the steam rise in rhythmic puffs, and I wonder if the machine is trying to tell us that it is tired. The metal itself seems to groan under the psychic weight of the being it supports, the girders twisting in ways that defy the laws of physics, as if the palace is being slowly crushed by the gravity of its own importance. There is no joy in this service, only the grim satisfaction of delaying the inevitable for one more hour, one more day, one more heartbeat. We are the janitors of a mausoleum that spans a galaxy, sweeping the dust of fallen stars into piles while the walls crumble around us. The taste of copper in my mouth never leaves, a permanent reminder of the blood that has been shed and the iron that is failing us both. I have forgotten the color of a true sky, having spent my entire existence under the flickering lumen globes and the oppressive vaults of the throne world, where the only thing that shines is the terrifying radiance of a dying god. The logistical strain of maintaining the throne world is a nightmare of parchment and bureaucracy that would drive a lesser mind to madness. Every day, thousands of massive bulk conveyors arrive in the Terran system, their holds bursting with the grain of 100 agri-worlds. Yet the hunger in the lower hives never abates. I see the manifests for the atmospheric scrubbers, the water recycling plants, and the heat sinks that keep the palace from melting into the crust of the planet. And every document is a testament to a system that is overtaxed and under-maintained. We are cannibalizing parts from the lower levels to keep the upper sanctums functional, a desperate shell game of mechanical survival. If a pump fails in the western quadrant, we strip the gears from a dormant manufactorum in the south, knowing full well that we are merely moving the point of failure rather than resolving it. The air in my quarters is thin and tastes of ozone because the primary oxygenator for my block was sacrificed to keep a stasis field active in the Hall of Heroes. This is the reality of the Imperium, a constant, grinding sacrifice of the many to preserve the few, and the few to preserve the one. I have spent decades in the scriptorum, my fingers permanently stained with the ink of 1,000,000 death warrants and supply requisitions, recording the slow starvation of entire sub-sectors so that the lights on Terra do not dim. There is a cold, clinical horror in seeing the population of a hive world reduced to a series of negative integers on a ledger, knowing that the lack of a specific cooling component has doomed 5 billion people to a slow death by asphyxiation. We do not cry for them. We do not have the moisture to spare. The water we drink has been through 1,000 kidneys before it reaches our lips, filtered through layers of ancient grit and chemical purifiers until it tastes like nothing but wet stone. Every sip is a reminder of the cycles of recycling that define our existence, from the air we breathe to the thoughts we are permitted to think. The palace itself is a living organism of stone and steel, and it is sick. I can feel the vibrations in the floorboards, the irregular shuddering of the great tectonic stabilizers that prevent the weight of the spires from triggering massive earthquakes. Sometimes, the tremors are so violent that ancient tapestries fall from the walls, revealing the raw, scarred metal beneath. Covered in the scratchings of desperate men who were trapped in the maintenance shafts centuries ago. We find their bones occasionally, polished white by the constant flow of grit-laden air, still clutching the wrenches and oil cans they used in their final, futile moments. Their sacrifice bought us a few more years of light, and our sacrifice will buy the next generation a few more years of shadow. It is a cycle of entropy that we cannot break, for to break it would be to admit that the great work is unfinished and the architect is silent. I often look at the icons of the saints that line the hallways, their stone faces worn smooth by the touch of 1 billion pilgrims, and I wonder if they ever felt this sense of impending stillness. The silence is the worst part, not the absence of sound, for the palace is always screaming with the noise of steam and grinding gears, but the silence of the warp, the terrifying void that opens up when the Astronomicon wavers, in those split seconds of psychic darkness. The palace feels like it is floating in an ocean of oil, and the things that live in the deep are pressing their faces against the glass. The light of the dying god is a physical pressure, a golden heat that cooks the air and turns the dust into glittering motes of fire. It is not the warmth of a sun, but the blistering radiation of a furnace that is being fed the souls of the faithful. I have stood at the edge of the soul, binding chambers, where the psychic choir is renewed, and I have heard the sound of 1,000 screams merging into a single, terrifying note of pure agony. This is the fuel that keeps the darkness at bay, a mountain of human suffering that is shoveled into the maw of the Golden Throne every single day. We pretend it is a holy ritual, a sacred transition from the physical to the spiritual, but the smell says otherwise. It smells of burning hair, of ozone, and of a fear so potent it stains the very stones of the floor. My role in this is to ensure the tally is correct, to witness the processing of the black ship's cargo and verify that the tithe of psychers is sufficient to keep the beacon burning. I have seen them, the young and the old, huddled together in the damp holds of the ships, their eyes wide with a terror that no amount of prayer can soothe. They are the tallow for the candle, and I am the clerk who counts the wicks. There is no room for pity in the heart of a servant of the throne. Pity is a luxury for those who do not know how close the fire is to going out. If the screaming stops, the galaxy dies. This is the fundamental equation of our existence, a brutal arithmetic that justifies any atrocity in the name of survival. The pressure in my skull intensifies whenever a new batch is committed to the fire, a psychic backsplash that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur with static. I have seen men claw their eyes out rather than witness the radiance of the Emperor's will, and I have seen others fall to their knees in a transport of joy that is indistinguishable from madness. We are all mad here, in one way or another. You have to be to live in the shadow of a god who is also a corpse. The machinery that surrounds the throne is a labyrinth of brass and iron, a mountain of technology that no one fully understands. I have seen the tech, priests chanting in binary over a failing regulator, their mechanical voices rising in a frantic plea to a spirit that has long since abandoned the metal. They smear sacred oils over cracked casings and zip, tie ancient sensors to rusted pipes, a desperate patchwork of faith and desperation. The tragedy of the Mechanicus is that they worship the tool but have forgotten the purpose of the work. They treat the throne like a relic to be venerated rather than a machine to be repaired, and so the rot continues to spread, unnoticed beneath the layers of gold leaf and holy wax. I once saw a leak in a primary coolant line, a spray of iridescent blue fluid that was freezing the air solid. Instead of sealing the breach, the acolytes built a shrine around it, declaring the leak a miraculous manifestation of the Emperor's tears. We are drowning in miracles while the ship goes down. I have spent my nights in the lower archives, where the air is so thick with the smell of old paper and decay that it feels like breathing in a tomb. These are the records of the centuries we have lost, the accounts of wars that were never won and heroes who were forgotten before their bodies were cold. I find mentions of technologies that sound like fairy tales, machines that could heal the sick without a prayer, or engines that did not require the sacrifice of human souls to function. These are the ghosts of a different future, one that was stolen from us by the hubris of the past. Now, we are left with the dregs of a dying age, clutching our rusted lasguns and praying to a silent master. The vibrations of the palace are different down here. They are deeper, more resonant, a tectonic growling that suggests the very foundations of terror are tired of supporting our weight. I find myself wondering what will happen when the final gear shears, when the last cooling pump ceases, and the golden light finally fades. Will the darkness be a relief? Or will it be the final, ultimate horror that we have spent 10,000 years trying to avoid? I see the answer in the faces of the pilgrims who crowd the outer gates, their bodies broken by the journey, their eyes filled with a desperate hope that I know is a lie. They have come to see the light, but all they will find is the heat of a dying furnace. The logistics of the pilgrimage are another layer of the nightmare. Millions of people dying in the streets of the hive, their bodies processed into corpse, starch to feed the next wave of arrivals. It is a closed loop of death and consumption, a planetary, scale meat grender that feeds on the faith of the poor. I have to sign the sanitation reports for the pilgrim districts, and the numbers are staggering. We measure the piles of the dead in tons, not in individuals. There is no dignity in death on Terra, only the cold efficiency of the reclamation vats. And yet, they keep coming. They come because the alternative is a darkness they cannot even imagine, a void where there are no gods, only hungry things that wait for the fire to go out. I have seen the shadow projections on the wall of the inner sanctum, the psychic maps that show the movement of the Tyranid hives and the awakening of the Necron dynasties. We are a flickering candle in a room full of monsters, and the wax is running low. The copper taste in my mouth has turned to the flavor of cold ash, and I realize that I am no longer waiting for the end. I am living in it. The documentary of our species is being written in the language of failure, and I am the one holding the pen. The descent into the lower reaches of the palace is not a journey through space, but a journey through the geological layers of human failure. To reach the primary heat exchangers, one must pass through levels that have not seen a living soul in generations, where the air is so thick with the particulate matter of pulverized stone and ancient bone that every breath feels like swallowing a handful of dry earth. I was sent there to investigate a rhythmic thudding that was vibrating through the floor of the High Lord's Council chamber, a sound like a giant's fist striking a hollow drum. What I found was a section of the atmospheric processing plant that had become sentient in the most horrific mechanical sense. The logic engines had long since rotted away, replaced by a tangled web of copper wire and calcified grease that pulsed with a life of its own. It was a machine that had forgotten its purpose but refused to die, a microcosm of the Imperium itself. The smell was an overwhelming cocktail of rancid oil ozone and the unmistakable sweetness of decaying organic matter used as makeshift insulation. Down here, the light of the Astronomicon is a distant myth, replaced by the flickering, sickly green glow of failing emergency lumen globes that hum with a frequency that makes your teeth vibrate in their sockets. I saw servitors there that had been functioning for 1,000 years, their flesh little more than leather stretched over iron frames, performing the same repetitive tasks with a mindless, terrifying devotion. One was attempting to polish a section of wall that had long ago collapsed into rubble, its metal arm grinding against the stone until the air was thick with grey dust. It did not see me. It could not see anything beyond the programmed imperative of its existence. We are all like that servitor, grinding ourselves into nothingness against the ruins of a reality that no longer exists. The pressure in my skull became a sharp, localized stabbing behind my left eye as I moved deeper into the heat sinks. The heat was not the dry warmth of a summer day, but a wet, oppressive weight that smelled of boiling coolant and stagnant water. It is here that the physical cost of the Emperor's survival is most apparent. The sheer energy required to keep a single consciousness tethered to a dead body produces enough thermal waste to turn the sub-levels of the palace into a literal hell. I watched as the cooling pipes, some as wide as a battle tank, groaned and buckled under the strain, their iron skins weeping a caustic red fluid that hissed as it hit the floor. This is the blood of the machine, and it is running thin. I found the source of the thudding in a cavernous chamber that had once been a secondary power relay. A massive piston, disconnected from its housing by centuries of vibration, was swinging freely from a rusted ceiling mount, striking a structural support beam with every revolution of the main drive shaft. The beam was deformed, a massive indentation of twisted steel that threatened the integrity of the entire sector. If that beam fails, the ceiling collapses, and with it, the floor of the Hall of Judgment 3 kilometers above. I watched the piston strike the metal, thrum, crack, and realized that the sound was the only thing keeping the rhythm of the palace. If I stopped it, the silence would return, and the silence is always more dangerous than the noise. I stood there for a long time, the taste of rust on my tongue, watching the sparks fly with every impact. The beauty of the destruction was hypnotic. It was a pure, honest expression of entropy, a machine finally breaking free of the logic that had birthed it. I saw a group of tech adepts nearby, their red robes black with grease, chanting a litany of stabilization around a leaking steam vent. They were ignoring the swinging piston. Perhaps because they didn't have the tools to fix it, or perhaps because their faith didn't allow them to acknowledge a failure of that magnitude. To them, the piston's strike had become a part of the holy environment, a sacred percussion to be incorporated into their prayers. This is how we survive the end of the world, by redefining our collapse as a form of worship. I reached out and touched the vibrating wall, and I could feel the palace screaming. It wasn't a metaphor. The psychic resonance of the throne is so powerful that it imprints itself on the very materials of the building. The stone is saturated with 10,000 years of agony, of hope, and of the sheer, terrifying will of a being that refuses to let go. The walls don't just hold the roof up, they hold the weight of a species' survival, and they are tired. I could feel the molecules of the granite trembling, a sub-atomic fatigue that no amount of reinforcement could ever heal. We are building on a foundation of exhaustion. As I climbed back toward the middle spires, the air grew thinner and colder. The transition between the sweltering heat sinks and the refrigerated archives of the administratum marked by a corridor of perpetual frost. Here, the moisture in the air freezes into delicate, jagged crystals that coat the statues of forgotten heroes like a second skin of glass. My breath came in ragged plumes of white, and the iron taste in my mouth sharpened into the flavor of a cold knife. This is the level where the bureaucrats live and die. Men and women who have spent their entire lives calculating the trajectory of a collapse they will never see completed. I passed a row of scribes. Their fingers blue with cold, scratching numbers into ledgers that will be buried in the archives before the ink is dry. There is a terrible, quiet dignity in their futility. They know that their work will likely never be read, that the tithes they calculate will never be collected. Yet they continue because the alternative is to acknowledge the void. I saw one man, his eyes clouded with cataracts, weeping silently as he wrote. The tears froze on his cheeks, turning into tiny pearls of ice that fell onto the parchment. He was recording the loss of a star system, a collection of worlds that had been swallowed by a warp storm 3 decades ago, but the report had only just reached his desk. To the Imperium, those people are still alive on paper, a ghost population paying ghost taxes to a ghost emperor. We are a civilization of echoes. The light of the dying god reaches even here, filtered through kilometers of leaded glass and reinforced macro-plastic, appearing as a pale, sickly amber that casts long, distorted shadows. In those shadows, I see the movement of things that are not human. The palace is home to 1,000 different species of vermin, from mutated rats to psychic parasites that feed on the ambient dread of the inhabitants. They are the only things thriving in this environment, growing fat on the rot and the misery. I watched a multi-limbed thing scuttle across a high vaulted ceiling, its movements fluid and silent, and I felt a pang of envy. It had no ledgers to maintain, no failing machinery to fear. It only had the hunt. The further I moved from the throne, the more the reality of terror asserted itself. Beyond the inner walls, the palace merges with the hive, a seamless transition from holy sanctum to industrial slaughterhouse. I looked out from a high observation balcony and saw the horizon of the throne world, a jagged, broken teeth of spires and smoke stacks that vomited black bile into an orange sky. There is no green on this planet. There is no water that has not been through a machine. There is only the gray of concrete, the black of soot, and the dull, tarnished gold of the elite. The scale of it is impossible to process. It is a world-sized tombstone, a monument to a species that conquered the stars only to find itself trapped on a dying rock. The wind that whipped around the balcony smelled of chemicals and burnt rubber, a harsh, scoring breeze that tasted of the end of time. I saw a flock of scavenger birds, cyborg corvids with brass beaks and optical sensors, wheeling over a pile of industrial waste. Their mechanical cries sounding like the grinding of gears. They are the heralds of our future, a fusion of the biological and the mechanical that retains the worst traits of both. I felt a sudden, violent urge to jump, to let the wind take me and end the constant, grinding pressure in my head. But I did not jump. I cannot jump. I am a part of the machine, a cog that has been worn smooth but still fits its slot. My duty is to witness, to record, and to ensure that the tally of our decline is accurate to the last decimal point. The God Emperor does not need my life. He needs my service. He needs me to stay in the dark, in the cold, and in the heat, and to never look away from the horror. As I turned back toward the interior of the palace, I felt the vibration again, thrum, crack, the heartbeat of a dying god, echoing through the marrow of my bones. It is the only thing that tells me I am still alive. The copper taste returned, stronger now. The flavor of a world that has been chewed up and spat out by history. We are the leftovers of a feast that ended 10,000 years ago, and the plates are being cleared away. The logistics of the soul, harvest, are the most closely guarded secret of my department. A series of ledgers bound in human skin that detail the exact number of cycles required to keep the flame from flickering out. I have seen the projections for the next century, and the line is a steep, downward curve. We are running out of fuel. Not because there are fewer cycles, but because the warp is becoming more turbulent, demanding a higher and higher price for every light year of navigation. The Golden Throne is a gluttonous beast, its appetite growing even as its health fails. I have watched the black ships dock at the orbital plates, their holds humming with the muffled screams of thousands of captives. They are processed with a cold, industrial efficiency that makes the blood sacrifices of ancient earth look like acts of mercy. Here there is no passion, no religious fervor, only the mechanical application of psychic energy to a failing conduit. I saw a girl, no older than 12, being led toward the soul-binding chambers. She wasn't crying, she was simply vacant, her mind already broken by the null fields of the ship. She was just another unit of energy, a battery to be drained and discarded. I had to sign her intake form, a scrap of parchment that reduced her entire existence to a serial number and a psychic grade. My hand didn't shake. If you let your hand shake, the machine stops, and if the machine stops, the galaxy burns. That is the bargain we have made. We trade our humanity for another hour of light. A trade that has left us with nothing but the light and a hollow shell where our souls used to be. The pressure in my skull intensified as the girl was led through the heavy adamantium doors, a sympathetic resonance that made my vision swim with golden sparks. For a moment, I saw the palace not as a building, but as a vast, interconnected web of suffering, every stone laid in blood, every beam forged in agony. It is a temple built on a foundation of screams, and the deity it houses is the greatest sufferer of all. The Emperor is not a king. He is a prisoner, bound to a chair of agony by the needs of a species that refuses to die. We are the jailers, and we are the inmates. There is no escape from this cycle, for the exit is a darkness that is far worse than the cage. I walked back to my quarters, the sound of the swinging piston still echoing in my mind, a rhythmic reminder of the time we have left. Thrum, crack. Thrum, crack. The countdown is not in years but in impacts. One day, the beam will snap. One day, the light will fail. And on that day, the copper taste in our mouths will finally turn to the sweetness of the end. The silence of the navigator's quarter is a different breed of quiet than the mechanical hum of the scriptorum, for it is a silence pregnant with the weight of the warp itself. I was summoned there to verify the expenditure of soul, tallow for a voyage that would never happen. A clerical errand that led me into the presence of those whose eyes have looked upon the raw fabric of the universe and been unmade by the sight. The air in these vaulted chambers is kept at a crushing pressure to prevent the leaks of psychic miasma that often seep from the pores of the navigators, and every breath I took felt like inhaling liquid lead. It is a place of heavy velvets, tarnished silver, and the constant, rhythmic clicking of ancient gauger, counters that measure the stability of the veil. I walked past portraits of dynasties that have served the throne since the birth of the Imperium, their faces distorted by the mutations of their bloodline, their three eyes covered by bands of blessed silk. They are the true aristocracy of this decaying age, the only ones who can see the path through the storm, and yet they are as much slaves to the machinery as the lowest hive worker. I watched a young scion of House Belisarius being prepared for his first immersion in the navigational tanks. His skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his extra limb was twitching in a rhythmic, involuntary spasm. The attendants were chanting in a low, guttural dialect of High Gothic, their voices muffled by the heavy respirators they wore to survive the navigator's presence. There is no warmth here, only the cold, clinical preparation for a journey that involves piercing the heart of a nightmare. The navigators see the Astronomicon not as a beacon of hope, but as a scream of light in an ocean of teeth. They tell us that the light is changing, that the golden fire of the Emperor is being strangled by the encroaching shadows of the Great Rift. They see the eddies in the Imperium that we only feel as a vague sense of unease, and their reports are filled with the descriptions of tides that flow backward and stars that have begun to weep blood. To record these things is to invite a specific kind of madness into your soul, a realization that the geography of our empire is a fragile hallucination maintained by a dying man's will. I sat in a small side chamber, the walls covered in charts that depicted the shifting currents of the warp as a series of chaotic, swirling halls of ink. The ink itself seemed to move when I looked away. A trick of the light, or perhaps a lingering psychic residue from the cartographer who had drawn them. My task was to balance the books on the warp fuel, a task that required me to account for the thousands of ships that enter the Imperium and never return. We call them the lost and the damned in the ledgers, a cold euphemism for the millions of souls swallowed by the warp, entities that lurk between the stars. I saw the casualty rates for the Segmentum Pacificus, and the numbers were so high they ceased to have meaning. It was like counting grains of sand in a desert of blood. The logistics of the Imperium are built on the assumption of loss. We build 3 ships because we know only one will arrive, and we train 10 million soldiers because we know 9 million will be dead before they fire a shot. This is the geometry of the meat grinder, and it is my job to ensure the grinder never runs out of meat. The pressure in my skull was a dull, rhythmic thrumming, a sympathetic vibration with the navigator's psychic pulse. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a phantom sensation of a ship being torn apart by the pressures of the void, and I realized that the palace itself is a ship, and we are all its crew, huddled together in the dark while the hull groans and the engines scream. I looked at my hands, stained with the ink of 1,000 tragedies, and I wondered if the Emperor ever feels the weight of the lives he consumes to stay awake. Or has he become so detached from the physical world that we are nothing more than the electrical impulses in a failing circuit? The incense in the room was thick and cloying, a mixture of sandalwood and the sharp, chemical smell of warp, suppressant drugs, a scent that sticks to your skin and follows you home like a shroud. I left the navigator's quarter and made my way toward the outer walls of the palace, where the sheer scale of the planetary defense systems becomes visible. The walls are not merely stone and steel, they are mountains of weaponry, miles of macro, cannon batteries and void, shield generators that hum with enough energy to boil an ocean. I saw the crews who man these guns, men and women whose entire lineage has lived and died within the span of a single turret. They are born in the magazines, they marry in the loading bays, and they are buried in the scrap heaps of the lower decks. Their world is the size of a gun barrel, and their god is the trigger. The air here is a thick soup of cordite, grease, and the constant, low-frequency roar of the shield generators that makes your vision blur. I watched as a massive crane lowered a shell the size of a hab block into the breech of a Nova cannon, the chains groaning under the weight. The sound of metal on metal, a deafening shriek that echoed through the vaults. This is the iron fist of the Emperor, a fist that is beginning to rust. I saw a technician trying to patch a leak in a hydraulic line with a piece of scrap metal and a prayer strip, his movements frantic as the high-pressure fluid sprayed out in a fine, red mist. He didn't have the proper seal, because the last shipment of seals from Mars was lost to a pirate raid 3 years ago. So he used what he had, a desperate, temporary fix for a permanent problem. We are a civilization of temporary fixes. The walls are covered in the graffiti of 10,000 years of soldiers, names, dates, and prayers scratched into the metal with bayonets and laser cutters. Most of them are illegible now, worn smooth by the passage of time and the constant vibration of the machinery. They are the ghosts of the palace, the millions of nameless defenders who have stood on these ramparts and watched the stars, waiting for an enemy that never stops coming. The horizon was a haze of industrial fire and toxic clouds, a landscape of endless war and preparation for war. I felt the vibration of the swinging piston again, a deep, tectonic thrum that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. Thrum, crack, thrum, crack. It was the heartbeat of the defense, the sound of a giant trying to stay awake while its limbs fail. The pressure in my skull shifted, becoming a sharp, icy needle of pain that signaled the approach of a custodes. I saw him moving through the crowded corridor, a golden giant who seemed to radiate a light of his own, a purity that was offensive in this world of filth and decay. The crowds parted like water before a prow, people falling to their knees in a mixture of awe and terror. He did not look at them. He did not look at me. He was a being of pure purpose, a living weapon forged for a war that has been going on for 10 millennia. I watched the way the light played off his auramite armor, a golden luster that put the flickering lumen globes to shame. He was a reminder of what humanity once was, or what it was meant to be, and the contrast between him and the starving, huddled masses of the palace was a physical blow to my spirit. We are the dregs, and he is the wine. I saw the blood on his cloak, a dark, crimson stain that looked like a map of a forgotten galaxy. He had been fighting something in the webway, or the deep sub-levels. A war that we are not allowed to know about, a war for the very soul of the throne world. The smell he brought with him was the smell of ozone, of dry earth, and of a strange, floral scent that felt like a memory of a world I have never seen. He disappeared into the shadows of the inner sanctum, and the air felt colder, the light dimmer, as if he had taken a portion of the Emperor's radiance with him. I stayed where I was for a long time, my fingers tracing the cold iron of a nearby railing, wondering if even the golden giants know how close we are to the end. Do they feel the vibration in the floor? Do they taste the copper in the air? Or are they so far removed from our reality that they cannot see the rust eating away at the foundations of the throne? The silence that followed his passage was the silence of a grave, a heavy, oppressive stillness that made the sound of my own heartbeat feel like a violation. I spent the evening in a small, windowless office, reviewing the casualty reports from the latest Orc incursion in the Armageddon sector. The numbers were staggering. Whole regiments of the Imperial Guard wiped out in a single afternoon, their names recorded in a script so small it required a magnifying lens to read. I found myself thinking about the girl I had seen in the soul binding chambers, the one who was just a battery for the fire. Was she more or less fortunate than the soldiers who died in the mud of a foreign world? At least her death had a purpose, a direct link to the survival of the God Emperor. The soldiers died for a few inches of dirt on a planet that will eventually be swallowed by the dark anyway. I felt a sudden, bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, a sound that felt like glass breaking in my chest. We are all just fuel. Some of us burn fast and bright, and some of us smolder in the dark for centuries, but we all end up as ash. I looked at the candle on my desk, a small, sputtering flame that was fighting against the draft from a cracked ventilation duct. It was a perfect metaphor for our existence, a fragile light in a vast, cold room, surrounded by shadows that are waiting for the wax to run out. I reached out and touched the flame, feeling the sharp, clean sting of the heat, a brief moment of reality in a world of ghosts. The taste of copper was back, stronger than ever, a metallic tang that made me want to retch. I realized then that I am not just a witness to the decline, I am a part of it. My body is failing, my mind is fraying, and my soul is being slowly ground into dust by the machinery of the state. I am a cog that is about to snap, a fuse that is about to blow, and when I do, there will be no one to replace me, for the knowledge of how to perform my duties is as lost as the stars themselves. The vibration in the floor intensified, a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of the universe. Thrum, crack, thrum, crack, thrum, crack. The darkness is not coming, it is already here. We are just the last ones to notice. The descent into the apothecarian sub-levels is a journey into the chemistry of a failing miracle. I was sent there to inventory the remaining vials of sacred rejuvenate fluids, substances whose recipes were lost during the age of apostasy, now rationed with a greed that borders on the murderous. The air in these sterile vaults does not smell of life, it smells of formaldehyde, scorched protein, and the sharp, clinical sting of industrial bleach. Here, the hum of the palace is replaced by the wet, rhythmic pulsing of vat-grown organs and the hiss of stasis fields that keep the last relics of our biological heritage from turning to putrid soup. I walked past rows of transparent cylinders where the experimental failures of the Magos biologists floated in suspended animation. Things with too many limbs, eyes that had melted into jelly, and skin that had crystallized into translucent scales. These are the discarded drafts of a species trying to rewrite its own expiration date. The light here is a harsh, flickering cyan that leaches the color from your skin, making everyone look like they are already 3 days dead. I saw an adept of the Mechanicus leaning over a microscope, his mechanical mechadendrites twitching with a frustration that was almost human. He was trying to synthesize a compound that could stabilize the cellular decay of the high-ranking administrators, but the base elements were no longer available in this sector of the galaxy. He was trying to cook a feast with nothing but ash and bone. The pressure in my skull felt like a cooling iron band being tightened around my temples, a physical manifestation of the biological debt we can no longer pay. We are stretching the human lifespan far beyond its natural limit, using chemical crutches that are themselves beginning to snap. I looked at my own reflection in the glass of a stasis tank and saw a man who was more parchment than flesh, held together by the very bureaucracy I serve. The records I was tasked to update were a terrifying inventory of depletion. The Imperium is not just running out of iron and souls, it is running out of the very essence of life. We are consuming our genetic legacy to fuel a war of attrition that has no end. I saw the statistics for the transformation of the common hive dweller, the increase in mutations, the decrease in fertility, the slow, steady rise of cancers that are the direct result of breathing the toxic soup we call an atmosphere. We are becoming a race of monsters and ghosts, our DNA unraveling under the pressure of 10,000 years of industrial abuse. I saw a report on the black teeth of the Adeptus Astartes, the desperate scramble to find viable gene seed in a galaxy where the human template is being corrupted by the warp and the filth of the hive. Even the angels of death are facing a biological twilight, their numbers thinning as the candidates for their transformation become increasingly rare. It is a slow-motion extinction, recorded in neat columns of Gothic script. The taste in my mouth shifted from the metallic tang of copper to the bitter, medicinal flavor of a dying ward. I watched as a servitor, its jaw replaced by a brass vox grill, wheeled a cart of discarded limbs toward the reclamation vats. It was a mundane sight, a routine part of the palace's housekeeping. But in the flickering blue light, it felt like the final summation of our achievements. We have turned the human body into a spare part, a commodity to be recycled until there is nothing left but the grit. I found myself in a corridor that led toward the great cooling towers, where the heat from the primary reactors is vented into the Terran sky. The vibration here was a violent, bone-shaking roar that drowned out all thought. I saw the massive intake fans, each one the size of a cathedral transept, spinning with a speed that blurred the air. They were caked in a thick, black grime that looked like the soot of 1 billion burnt lives. A group of men, naked to the waist and covered in the scars of heat blisters, were shoveling clumps of solidified sludge out of the drainage channels. Their eyes were white circles in faces blackened by carbon, their lungs surely filled with the same filth they were cleaning. They did not look up as I passed. They had no reason to. In this part of the palace, there is no rank, only the degree to which you are being consumed by the machine. I looked up through the venting slats and saw a sliver of the sky, a bruised, purplish gray that was choked with the contrails of 1,000 shuttle craft. It was a sky that offered no hope of heaven, only the certainty of more work. The vibration of the swinging piston from the lower levels seemed to sync with the roar of the fans, a double beat that felt like the palace was trying to shake itself apart. Thrum crack, thrum roar. I felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor beneath me was nothing more than a thin crust of metal over an infinite abyss. We are standing on the edge of a mechanical heart attack, waiting for the final blockage to stop the flow. As I ascended back toward the administrative spires, I passed through the Hall of Martyrs, a space so vast that its ceiling was lost in a permanent haze of incense and floating dust. The walls were lined with the sarcophagi of 1,000 saints, their stone effigies staring into the middle distance with an intensity that made me shiver. These were the men and women who had died to build this nightmare, and I wondered if they would recognize the ruin they had created. I saw a group of pilgrims huddled at the base of a particularly large statue, their voices raised in a thin, wavering chant that was lost in the vastness of the hall. They were praying for a miracle, a cessation of the pain, a return of the light, a sign that their suffering had a point. But the statue remained silent, its stone eyes indifferent to their plight. The light of the dying god did not reach this deep into the hall, leaving it in a perpetual, dusty twilight. I felt a pang of profound exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond the physical. It was the weariness of a civilization that has run out of ideas, that can only repeat the same prayers and fire the same guns until the end comes. I sat on a cold stone bench, my fingers tracing the deep, etched name of a long, dead general, and I realized that the Imperium is not a living thing. It is a machine that was programmed to survive, and it is following that program to the letter, even as its parts wear out and its fuel runs dry. It does not care about the quality of the life it preserves, only that the life continues to pulse. The evening was spent in the presence of the High Scriptor, a man so old that his skin had the texture of wet cardboard. He was surrounded by a dozen servo skulls that hovered in a tight orbit around his head, their optical sensors clicking as they recorded his every word. He spoke in a voice that was a dry rattle, a sound like dead leaves blowing across a pavement. He was telling me about the latest failures in the logistical chain, the loss of the grain worlds in the Ultima Segmentum, the collapse of the mining colonies on the fringes of the Eye. He spoke of these things as if they were nothing more than minor accounting errors, but I saw the truth in the way his mechanical hand trembled as he adjusted his robes. He was terrified. He knew that the numbers were finally catching up with us. He knew that the grand illusion of the Imperium was failing. I looked at the maps on the wall, the glowing points of light representing the Emperor's domains, and I saw how many of them were flickering, how many were already dark. It was a constellation of failure. The copper taste in my mouth was so strong now that I could feel it in the back of my throat, a constant, metallic reminder of the blood that is the true currency of our state. We are spending it faster than we can earn it. As I left his office, I saw a single, perfect teardrop fall from one of the servo skull's optical lenses. Even the machines are beginning to mourn. I returned to my quarters, the sound of the palace's slow motion collapse echoing in my ears. I opened my personal ledger, a small, worn book where I record the things that the official documents ignore. The smell of the air, the look in the eyes of the doomed, the way the light fails. I wrote a single line: the god is dying, and we have forgotten how to live without the shadow of his chair. I looked at the words until they blurred, the ink merging with the shadows of the room. The vibration in the floor was steady now, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to be coming from inside my own chest. Thrum, crack, thrum, crack. It is the sound of the end, and it is the only music we have left. I blew out the candle, but the darkness was not complete. There was still the faint, sickly glow of the palace's failing systems, a light that revealed only the decay. I lay there in the cold, listening to the palace scream, and I waited for the morning that would bring only more of the same. We are the inheritors of a broken dream, and our only duty is to ensure that the pieces are counted before they vanish into the void. The copper taste was my only companion, a cold, iron kiss that promised nothing but the grave. The final descent began not with a scream, but with a total cessation of the rhythmic thudding that had defined my heartbeat for 3 centuries. When the swinging piston in the heat sinks finally sheared its mounting, the silence that followed was more deafening than the impact had ever been. It was the silence of a clock that has finally run out of tension, a mechanical expiration that signaled the beginning of the end. I stood in the center of my scriptorum, my quill frozen over a requisition for atmospheric filters, and felt the temperature begin to drop with a terrifying, predatory speed. The ambient hum of the palace, that low-frequency vibration that we take for granted as the breath of the god emperor, vanished. In its place was only the sound of my own shallow, panicked respiration and the distant, wet coughing of the hive millions below. The lumen globes overhead flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving the room in a state of absolute, velvet darkness that felt thick enough to touch. I reached for my emergency torch, my fingers fumbling against the cold iron of my desk, and when the beam finally cut through the gloom, it revealed a world that had suddenly become a tomb. The dust motes were no longer dancing, they were settling, a grey shroud falling over the records of a civilization that had forgotten how to exist without the machine. I knew then that the final blockage had occurred. The light of the dying god was no longer a furnace, it was a guttering candle. And the shadows were finally winning the war of attrition they had been fighting for 10,000 years. I made my way toward the observation gallery of the Eternity Gate, my torchlight bouncing off the walls of a palace that now felt like a hollow carcass. The air was becoming stagnant, the oxygen scrubbers having lost their primary power, and the taste in my mouth was no longer copper, but the dry, chalky flavor of ancient ash. I passed hundreds of other functionaries in the corridors, their faces illuminated by the frantic, flickering light of their own torches. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The ledgers were closed. The tallies were finished. We were merely witnesses now, watching the final frames of a documentary that had lasted 100 centuries. As I reached the gallery, I looked out over the sprawling landscape of holy terror, and for the first time in my life, I saw the true face of the world. Without the artificial radiance of the spires, the planet was a jagged, lightless jagged tooth of black stone and rusted iron, silhouetted against a sky that had turned a bruised, terrifying violet. The Astronomicon was no longer a beam of golden hope, it was a fractured, spluttering spark, Like a dying star seen through a thick lens of oil, I saw the great rift pulsing in the distance, a wound in reality that was widening with every heartbeat, its purple light reflecting off the dead glass of the hive spires. The ships in orbit were no longer landing, they were drifting, their engines cold, their crews likely staring down at the darkening world in a state of catatonic shock. The trade routes were severed. The beacon was failing. The Imperium was becoming a collection of isolated islands in an ocean of monsters. I looked down into the courtyards of the palace, where the pilgrims had gathered in their millions. They were no longer praying. They were standing in a silence so profound it seemed to draw the heat out of the air. They were looking upward, their eyes reflecting the failing light of the throne, waiting for a miracle that would never come. I saw a group of custodes standing on the ramparts above them, their golden armor tarnished by the soot of a world that was no longer breathing. Even they seemed diminished, their monumental purpose stripped away by the mechanical failure of the very thing they were sworn to protect. They were statues of gold in a world of lead. The pressure in my skull reached a crescendo, a psychic scream that was the collective realization of a quadrillion souls that the end was not a fire, but a cold, quiet stillness. I felt the weight of every requisition I had ever signed, every death warrant I had ever filed, every calorie of food I had ever diverted from a starving mouth to keep the palace running. It had all been for this a moment of absolute, freezing clarity. We were the guardians of a corpse, and the corpse was finally turning to dust. I reached out and touched the glass of the observation window, and the coldness of it seemed to seep into my marrow, a premonition of the eternal winter that was about to descend upon the galaxy. The darkness was not just outside, it was filling the hallways, the archives, the soul-binding chambers, and the hearts of the men who had spent their lives serving a machine that had finally broken. The shadows on the wall began to move, not with the flickering of a torch, but with a life of their own. I saw the reflections of things that should not exist in the light of holy terror, the elongated limbs of warp entities, the shimmering outlines of predators that had been waiting for the fire to dim. They were the true inheritors of the galaxy, the things that had outlasted the gods and the empires. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. The struggle was over. The gears had stopped. The copper taste was gone, replaced by the sweetness of the void. I opened my personal ledger to the last page, and by the fading light of my torch, I wrote the final entry. The machine is still. The god is silent. We are alone in the dark. I closed the book and laid it on the railing, a final testimony for a future that would never have the eyes to read it. The Astronomicon gave one final, violent pulse, a blinding flash of white that illuminated the ruins of the palace for a fraction of a second, and then it vanished. The sky went black. The air went still. The silence was absolute. We had lived under the halo of a dying god for so long that we had forgotten the stars were cold. Now, we would remember. I stood there in the absolute dark, listening to the first screams of the pilgrims as the things from the warp began to descend. They were not screams of terror, but screams of recognition. We had always known this was coming. We had built our entire civilization around the delay of this specific second. And now that it was here, there was a terrible, beautiful honesty to it. The lies of the state, the rituals of the Mechanicus, the grand strategy of the High Lords, all of it was stripped away, leaving only the raw, naked truth of our insignificance. I felt the first flake of snow fall against my cheek, but it wasn't water, it was ash. The palace was beginning to crumble, the stones finally surrendering to the gravity they had defied for 10 millennia. I closed my eyes and waited for the end, a servant of the throne, until the very last gear ceased to turn. The documentary was over. The lights were out. The only thing left was the cold, and the hunger of the things that wait in the silence between the stars.